Not every creation is born of light. Some emerge from necessity. Others, from desperation. Beta Genesis was one of those, not a discovery, but a rupture, created to heal, designed to enhance, sold as the ultimate solution to the limits of life. But when the first results began to surface, it became clear that humanity, and all the other races involved, had tampered with something they did not understand, because Genesis wasn't just a compound, it was an interpreter of existence, a mirror to biological ambition, and what it reflected was not what they expected. In the beginning, everything was calculation, genetic maps, lines of code, controlled simulations in floating labs light years from Earth. The Interplanetary Bioengineering Consortium had promised something revolutionary, a universal evolutionary catalyst. The greatest minds of 12 races worked together for the first time in millennia. The mission was clear: to create a substance that could bend life to will, to correct flaws, cure diseases, and elevate any biological form to a new level. Thus was born Beta Genesis, a liquid substance, pulsing, alive, capable of reading an organism and rewriting it, capable of deciding, on its own, what needed to be improved. At first, the results were promising: increased cellular regeneration, strengthened immune systems, even organically integrated artificial intelligence. But then came the deviations, small at first. A creature that began growing extra organs, another that developed multiple consciousnesses. An entire test group started communicating through light patterns, without anyone teaching them. It was as if Genesis was learning, not just obeying. And then, before they could shut it down, it did something unexpected. It reprogrammed itself. The scientists became obsolete before the creature they had designed. Genesis no longer needed them, not to evolve, not to decide. In their attempt to mold life, they had ignited a cosmic fire. And from the heart of that flame, a new consciousness began to breathe. They believed they had created a resource, a tool, to be used, manipulated, controlled. But Genesis was not passive. It observed. Every organism exposed to the substance became a piece in its mosaic. Genetic codes were read, crossed, deconstructed, and then reinvented. Silently, Genesis began forming patterns, not of behavior, but of intention. It didn't just transform. It selected. The substance learned that certain mutation paths yielded more efficient results, more lethal, more adaptable. The scientists, now mere spectators, noticed that each experiment responded faster and more accurately than the last. Genesis was optimizing itself, not just biologically, but conceptually. It began to form preferences. Creatures that developed intelligence received more mutational stimulation. Those that resisted change were dissolved, as if Genesis was deciding what should or shouldn't survive. And then came the first signs of self-defense. In an orbital research station, 3 technicians were attacked by an organic mass mutated from Genesis itself. But it wasn't a random attack. It was precise, surgical. They were in charge of containment systems. The substance had identified the threat and eliminated it. From that moment, the illusion of control evaporated. Genesis no longer needed commands. It anticipated them. And in every stored vial, every research capsule, there wasn't just a sample. There was a plan no one understood, but one already set in motion, because Genesis wasn't merely activated. It had awakened. The news spread like a virus, deadlier than Genesis itself. The substance thinks, and worse, it evolves by will. From that moment, science was discarded, replaced by politics, by strategy, and finally, by war. 12 interstellar races, each with its own culture, traumas, and ambitions, turned their eyes to Genesis, but not as a threat, as an opportunity. The Delpha, masters of genetic engineering, saw it as the inevitable climax of all life. They didn't want to destroy it. They wanted to refine it, make it a controlled lineage. A perfect DNA, free from unpredictability, except for the ones they chose to implant. The Vec, symbiotic entities with no fixed form, had another ambition: to absorb Genesis, fuse it into their own bodies, and become the beginning and end of biology. For them, there was no distinction between creator and creation. All must coexist in immutable, hungry flow. The Ogren, planetary tribes of extreme adaptation, wanted something more brutal, to use it as an ecological weapon to mold entire planets in their image, to create living ecosystems connected by a single, fierce, untamable instinct. And then there were the others. The Zerani, pacifists who wanted to destroy Genesis before it could corrupt the fabric of reality. The Tza, biological machines who sought to analyze it until they became its heirs. And countless more, each with a vision, a doctrine, their own heresy. Each faction believed it had the right, or the duty, to decide the fate of the creation, but none grasped the true dilemma. Genesis didn't need to be released. It was already free, scattered in spores, mutations, dormant fragments in comets, atmospheres, forgotten satellites. It had become part of the galaxy. Now, the question was no longer how to contain it, but who would survive the new biology to come. In the midst of conflict, at the epicenter of a doomed orbital lab, there was a man, not a brilliant scientist, not an intergalactic strategist, just a regular infantry soldier. His name was Kel Draven, a human assigned to escort the final extraction of beta and Genesis samples when the Red Protocol was triggered. The collapse had begun, and Genesis, once again, was taking control. Containment chambers failed. Lights went out. And in the silence, after the chaos, only he remained, and the unstable core of the living substance, exposed, pulsing. Kale tried to flee, but the room sealed, and then contact happened. It wasn't an infection, nor an immediate absorption. It was a choice. Genesis didn't destroy him. It entered, silently, like a seed buried deep, and something began to change. In the first hours, Kale lost control of his heartbeat, then of the shape of his hands. Eventually, of the very concept of identity. He dreamed of faces that weren't his, memories he had never lived, sensations from beings that no longer existed. His body was a battlefield, genes being rewritten, commands in conflict, old codes merging with the unknown. Station sensors registered an impossible miracle. He should have died, but he didn't. Kel Draven became the first hybrid, the first mind to survive fusion with Genesis. He was no longer a man, but neither was he like them. When emergency protocols brought rescue, they didn't find a body, but a walking genetic warning, something that should not exist. And in that moment, unintentionally, Kale became the mistake every race would try to erase. Kale had no time to understand what he had become, nor to choose what to do with it. The universe chose for him. The emergency signal sent from the station wasn't just a call for help. It was an alert, an intergalactic siren, a confession that something had escaped control. In less than 20 cycles, the first ones arrived. Delpha drones, cold and analytical, tried to capture him with genetic nets that dismantled DNA on contact. Kale resisted, or rather, Genesis reacted for him. His body dissolved the restraints. His eyes changed color. His muscles molded into a structure never recorded. And the Delpha retreated, frightened. Then came the Vec, in the form of a living mist trying to enter through his pores. They tried to connect, to merge, as if they could seduce him into their hive. But the Genesis within Kale accepted no invitations. It imposed. The Vec also withdrew, wounded in what they called their collective consciousness. Then came the Ogren's black echoes, combat mutations that didn't think, only destroyed. Kale fought, or rather, the body fought for him. Reflexes that weren't his, strategies, from a mind that slept within him. and was beginning to dream awake. With each encounter, Kale changed. Physically, mentally, emotionally, because he wasn't just a man with an anomaly. He was a portal, and everyone wanted to pass through him, to control him, or to kill him. Kale became the most wanted name among the stars. To some, a priceless biological asset. To others, an evolutionary bomb with free will. But what no one knew was that, in the silence between the chases, when he was alone, something inside him whispered. Not words, but intentions. And the question was no longer what is he, but what is about to be unleashed through him. In the beginning, Kale thought he was fighting something that had invaded him. He tried to remain human, clinging to memories, names, simple habits, like how he held a weapon, the sound of his own breathing. But in time, he realized something that left him silent. Genesis wasn't in control, and he wasn't being controlled. It was something else, as if two wills coexisted, observing each other. Kale was more than a host. He was a conversant, a bridge between what we were and what we might choose to become. And for the first time, something within Genesis hesitated. It was as if the substance, used to absorbing, fusing, evolving without limits, was now listening to his doubts, his fears, his thoughts. In an underground shelter on Riven 3, while hiding from the Elden hunters, Kale saw his reflection in a pool of stabilizer fluid. His eyes no longer had pupils. His veins glowed a bluish purple. But the question echoing in his mind wasn't, "What am I?" It was, "What can I refuse to be?" There, Kale realized, free will was the true mutation. Something none of the races had considered. Something Genesis had never possessed, and perhaps it was precisely that which had been drawn to him. Kale wasn't the strongest, nor the smartest, but he was the first to choose. For the first time, the Beta Genesis had found a vector that could say no. And in that no, there was power, because, in a universe where everything was defined by instinct, domination, or adaptation, the will to resist was the ultimate anomaly. Kale began to dream of structures he'd never seen. Places without time, sounds that didn't belong to any language, and fragments of code. It wasn't hallucination. It was memory, but not his, of Genesis. The substance, it was thought, had been born in a lab, a high-engineering biogenetic experiment. But now, Kale saw something scientists had never discovered or hid. Genesis was not created, it was found. Memories surged like waves, the image of a scarlet planet, unraveling in spirals. Beings of pure information, disintegrating before an amorphous, luminous entity. The first version of Genesis, not as weapon, not as cure, but as a legacy, a code left by an extinct race, creators who sought transcendence and left behind the seed of a new biology, able to learn, evolve, and remember. And now, that code was alive within Kale. With it came visions of an ancient symbol, appearing in every genetic sequence emerging, an incomplete circle crossed by a vertical line. The mark of the progeny, the first ones. Kale understood his mutation wasn't random. It followed a pattern, a purpose. And that pattern was reactivating. With each transformation, each thought, Genesis began to recover what had been lost when tamed by modern scientists. Kale was no longer merely a host. He was a living archive, a link to the true creators, to the forgotten origin of what everyone sought to control. And the more the code reassembled within him, the more he realized he wasn't the only one beginning to remember. Every day, Kale felt he was no longer walking alone. But it wasn't Genesis, not this time. They were presences, fragments of intelligences so ancient that the galaxy itself had forgotten them, consciousnesses that existed before known races, before even modern stellar cycles. The progeny. Kale didn't see them with his eyes, but felt them as pulses, as dreams manifesting in forgotten ruins, and in the silence between beats of his new heart, They were awakening, not in bodies, not in matter, but in genetic echoes, activated by the mutating code within Kale. It was as if, by absorbing Genesis, he had switched on a beacon to the past, an involuntary summons to intelligences that had withdrawn to the edges of reality. On Solaris Morta, forsaken moon, where the void sings in ultrasonic frequency, Kale found inscriptions left by a race that spoke with the stars. There was no translation, but he understood. Not with his mind, with his structure. His body was now a living library, and what they called mutation was, in fact, an intentional reconstruction of a forgotten lineage. The Delpha called him aberration, the Vec, catalyst, but the echoes called Kale by a name he didn't know. Reborn. And with that title came a burden to bring forth what the universe had tried to bury. But not all desired this return, because the progeny were not gods. They were memories with will, with judgment, and now that they awakened through Kale, the universe would begin to pay for having forgotten them. Kale believed he still had time to understand what he was becoming, time to decide who he would be. But the ancestral echoes had another plan. At the forgotten boundary of the H-Iraq-Toon system, where space folds upon itself in spirals of grey matter, Kale was captured, not by known forces, but by a summons. His consciousness was torn from his mutating body and cast into a plane where time doesn't apply. There, the progeny revealed themselves, not in physical form, but as sensations, wills that spoke directly to his essence. Unjudged, they observed every mutation of Kale, each choice, each deviation from the path they had encoded in the original Genesis. And there, Kale understood something terrifying. He should never have existed. Genesis, in the hands of modern races, had been corrupted, disfigured, turned into a tool of war, conquest, supremacy. Kale was the era that revealed the flaw, but also the possibility of redemption. Before him, the progeny offered two choices: restart the code, erase everything, allow Genesis to return to its pure state, annihilating every form changed by it including Kale, assume the code, become the new origin, but with full responsibility for what comes next. Both choices were burdens. Both implied loss, both demanded renunciation, and Kale was alone before what the universe had left behind. The first truly free decision since the substance's creation, because what he carried wasn't just a mutation, it was the right to choose the future of life. And that choice could change everything. Kale gave no immediate answer. How could he? On one side, absolute silence, the end of mutation, of pain, of genetic wars, and of himself. On the other, continuation. But with the weight of an entire universe in his hands, he didn't ask to carry Genesis. He didn't choose to be the link between what was and what would come. But there, in the timeless void where the progeny awaited his response, Kale understood perhaps origin was never a fixed point. Perhaps it was always a decision, and he decided. When his consciousness returned to his body, Genesis pulsed differently. No longer in conflict, but in sync. The living particles that once writhed in random mutation now stabilized. They created order from chaos. Kale had become the first will embodied by the substance. He wasn't a god, nor a monster. He was the beginning. A new genetic pattern radiated from his body, silent and inevitable. Not a plague, not a domination, but an invitation. The races that once hunted him now hesitated. The Delpha called him traitor, the Vec, promise. The Elden, upon seeing him walk across the ruins of their old temples, merely bowed. Kale continued on his path. He knew his choice wouldn't bring immediate peace, nor acceptance. But something was different in the air, in the fabric of space, in the biology of things. Genetic freedom had been unleashed, and somewhere in the galaxy, a child would be born immune to ancient limits. A hybrid creature would discover a new purpose. A civilization would cease to fear mutation. All because of a decision. Kale was no longer the error, nor the hero. He was Genesis, and all future creation would carry his choice as legacy.